There are criminals who rule through fear, and there are criminals who rule through influence. Then there was Frank Costello, a man who preferred a whisper to a bullet, a meeting to a massacre, and a phone call to a back-alley ambush. He was not the stereotypical Don perched behind a desk of threats. He was a broker of favors, a master of backroom politics, and for decades, the most powerful man most Americans never heard the full story about. They called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld. It was an apt title. Where other mobsters hoarded violence as currency, Costello exchanged access. He cultivated judges, politicians, union bosses, and newspapermen. He understood that modern power often hides behind suits and handshake deals rather than tomahawks and open gunfire. If Lucky Luciano built the corporate structure of the Mafia, Costello learned how to operate within the corridors of respectable influence, and to use them. Picture a rainy evening in pre-war New York, the city's elite sipping cocktails in glittering hotels, while under the polished veneer, deals are being made that will shape labor, gambling, and politics for years. Frank Costello stands slightly apart from the flashbulbs, his hair neatly combed, his suit immaculate, a faint cigarette smoke halo in the light. He does not shout, he does not pose, he listens, he remembers names. Later those names will answer his call. Costello was both invisible and indispensable. To the public, he was a smooth-talking operator who could be dismissed as a well-dressed thug. To the powerful, he was a conduit to votes, union muscle, and cash. To law enforcement, he was a frustrating phantom, proof that the modern underworld had learned an ancient lesson, that influence could be more durable than fear. But how does a man of modest origins become the go-between for municipal power brokers and the criminal world? How does one man build a web that can sway elections, protect rackets, and redirect labor contracts, and do it with such subtlety that his fingerprints often never appear on official records? Costello's genius lay in his restraint. He rarely sought headlines. He avoided flamboyant violence. Instead, he amassed quiet leverage. A judge convinced by a whispered recommendation. A police captain who looked the other way because a fundraiser had been handled discreetly. Yet Costello's life is not merely an instruction manual in soft power. It is a story of contrasts and contradictions. He was a man comfortable in two worlds, yet fully belonging to neither. He loved elegance, the restaurants, the theater box seats, the private clubs. But he also managed gambling dens, numbers operations, and prostitution rings. He could sit at a senator's luncheon and the next night sign receipts for underworld cash flow. He was polite and unflappable, yet ruthless when crossed. One defining feature separated Costello from many of his contemporaries. He believed in leveraging the system's weaknesses rather than smashing them. Where a rival might order a hit to fix a problem, loud, final, irreversible Costello would place a call. He cultivated politicians who owed him favors, union leaders who could shift votes or orchestrate strikes, and businessmen who could direct contracts. Power, for him, was a channel to be managed. That approach earned him victories and enemies. The post-war era's shifting sands tested Costello's network. New players in the Mafia, hungry for traditional dominance, resented his soft-touch strategies. At the same time, federal prosecutors and investigative journalists began to stitch together the web of influence he had long kept private. The very subtlety that protected him also created brittle points. A single failed alliance, a perceived slight, could spark a violent reaction from those who preferred direct action over whispered bargains. And there was one man who embodied that threat, a rival with old-school instincts and a taste for open power plays. Their clash would change the course of underworld history, but it wouldn't happen overnight. It would be years in the making, braided into politics and personal ambition, culminating in a night that would send shockwaves through both the Mafia and the halls of power in Washington. As the Senate prepared to shine a public light on hidden connections between crime and government, Costello's calm world came under a microscope. Televised hearings, aggressive prosecutors, and a new public appetite for scandal made his carefully cultivated anonymity suddenly dangerous. Yet the man who prided himself on backdoor deals had one more card to play. His mastery of influence extended to the very people tasked with exposing him. He knew how to parry with charm, evasiveness, and the occasional well-timed favor. This is the story of Frank Costello, not as a glamorized gangster, but as a political operator who weaponized relationships. His tale is about the modernization of corruption, how power can be legitimated through institutions while remaining corrosive beneath the surface. It is about the cost of invisibility, the risk of trusting allies, and the moment when whispered favors give way to open conflict. In the chapters ahead, you will meet the boy who learned the lessons of survival on the Lower East Side, the young racketeer who mastered numbers and gambling, the strategist who forged networks with union leaders and politicians, the older man who faced the most public reckoning of his life when the nation watched, and finally, the legacy he left behind. One that redefined the relationship between crime and American power. But first, imagine Costello in his office one evening, the city humming beyond the windows, a glass of scotch on the desk, a list of names under his palm. He picks up the phone and dials. A small favor here, a note there, a meeting arranged across town. That single act, an unobtrusive buzz of connection, was often enough to bend outcomes. For decades, that is how power worked, in the shadows. And then the lights came on. Frank Costello's story begins, like so many in the American underworld, not in a marble office or a private club, but in a cramped tenement and on a block where survival was the daily business. Born to immigrant parents and raised in the stew of New York's Lower East Side, he learned early that the city rewarded ingenuity as much as it punished weakness. Those lessons, learned in alleys, on stoops, and in crowded saloons, would become the scaffolding of a lifetime spent negotiating power. The Lower East Side at the turn of the century was less a neighborhood than a collision zone. Incoming immigrants jostled for space, work, and dignity. For young Frank, childhood was a short apprenticeship in toughness and in subtlety. Schoolrooms were often less impactful than the streets, where respect was measured by the size of your voice or the readiness of your fists. But unlike many boys who relied solely on brute strength, Frank showed a talent for reading people. He listened more than he spoke. He observed patterns others missed. That quiet attention would later make him an exceptional broker. Like many enterprising kids of his era, Costello learned to hustle early. Small jobs, carrying packages, running errands, hawking newspapers, were the first steps. Then came petty thefts, pickpocketing, and running errands for older neighborhood figures. Those errands were seldom innocent. They were introductions to the mechanisms of local rackets. He was a fast learner, but he was thoughtful in the way he learned, not simply copying the violence of the moment, but understanding the incentives that structured it. One of the most consequential early hustles was the numbers game. The numbers racket, a street lottery popular in urban immigrant neighborhoods, paid modest sums to its players, but vast returns to those who controlled the system. Costello recognized the elegance of the operation. Simple rules, predictable payoffs, loyal customers, and low overhead, provided the numbers men could keep the police at bay. He built relationships with collectors, runners, and bookmakers. He learned how to set the numbers, how to ensure cash flow, and most importantly, how to keep customers trusting the system. The numbers racket was a school in logistics and reputation management, core competencies for the man who would later broker deals between rackets and respectability. Another early lesson was the power of alliances, where older generation Sicilian bosses preferred bloodlines and suspicion of outsiders. Frank built bridges across ethnic lines. He befriended Jewish and Irish hustlers, making practical partnerships that married access to finance with street-level muscle. These cross-cultural alliances were strategic and transactional, but they also reflected Costello's political instinct. Power in the modern city belongs to those who can convert networks into leverage. Beyond the numbers game, Costello cut his teeth in gambling and bookmaking. He learned to run betting operations that catered to ordinary folk and to more well-heeled clients in private rooms and back alleys. He understood how to manage cash discreetly, how to protect operations from law enforcement via bribes or strategic favors, and how to cultivate patrons who could shield him when trouble came. Those patrons were not just underworld figures. They included precinct captains, union officials, and small-time politicians, men who preferred stability and the soft hum of steady payments over headline-grabbing violence. Costello's demeanor was crucial in this phase. Where some figures advertised menace, he cultivated a different currency: civility. He dressed well enough to blend into respectable bars and restaurants. He cultivated a calm voice and a memory for names that made people feel noticed and useful. He could sit with a union leader and speak like a confidant. He could be in a gambler's den and command obedience with a single glance. People trusted him because he rarely raised his voice and because he preferred influence to overt force. It was through these hustles that Costello began to attract attention from higher echelons of organized crime. Men who managed broader rackets, bootlegging, protection, and gambling on a larger scale noticed his capacity to arrange votes, placate unions, and move money cleanly. He became a natural intermediary, someone who could translate street operations into political cushioning. This made him useful not only to crime bosses, but also to corruptible officials who valued the quiet resolution of problems. Importantly, Costello rarely sought to be the biggest gun on the block. He sought to be the indispensable connector. That strategic modesty was an asset. When bigger names needed a favor smoothed out, a crooked cop calmed, a loan shark settled, a labor dispute cooled. They called Costello because he delivered without spectacle. His record in avoiding reckless exposure earned him trust. His ability to manufacture plausible deniability earned him protection. Yet the path was not free from setbacks. Like any ambitious operator on the margins of the law, Costello faced arrests and brushes with prison. He learned the careful art of minimizing legal exposure. Keep paper trails thin, avoid direct ownership of incriminating assets, and cultivate legal counsel and public-facing charities that created an image of respectability. More than once, he used charity work and public appearances to reshape public perception, an early indication of his belief in influence through image. By the time Prohibition reshaped the criminal economy, Costello was primed. The illegal liquor trade demanded men who could move product, manage payoffs, and handle the political economy of keeping docks, unions, and police in a workable balance. His early hustles, numbers, gambling, and political mediation were the ideal foundation. He didn't need to be the king of the street to profit from the new era. He needed to be the man who could keep the gears of illicit commerce greased and quiet. In retrospect, those Lower East Side years read less like youthful crimes and more like the foundational training of a political operator. Where others learned to swing a club, Frank learned to place a phone call. Where some amassed muscle, he amassed contacts. Those early hustles, humble and often crude, were the laboratory where Frank Costello converted survival instincts into the tools of statecraft in the underworld. The tools that would let him operate for decades as a broker of favors, a cultivator of influence, and eventually, the man the press would call the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Frank Costello's ascent was not a sudden seizure of power. It was an accumulation of small, disciplined gains, each one a careful stitch in a web of revenue streams, favors, and political leverage. By the time he moved from neighborhood hustles into the wider world of organized crime, he had already discovered two enduring truths. First, steady, low-visibility income beats occasional spectacular hits. Second, influence in polite society is the most valuable currency of all. The core of Costello's early expansion lay in the numbers. Racket, the street lottery that became the heartbeat of American urban vice. Unlike a single high-risk heist, the numbers game offered constant cash flow, millions of small bets placed across immigrant neighborhoods every week. Costello mastered the mechanics. He set collection networks, protected runners from police interference, and ensured payouts were prompt and reliable, so the populace continued to trust the system. That trust was everything. When a numbers operation was fair, customers returned. When it failed, violence or bankruptcy followed. Costello's talent was turning that fragile trust into institutionalized income. But he didn't stop at collections. Costello understood that to keep a numbers racket profitable required more than muscle. It required insulation from law enforcement and smooth relations with municipal officials. So he built a protective canopy. Precinct captains and local judges became quiet partners via small bribes, favors, and the occasional useful tip. Politicians who wanted street votes or union support found it profitable to accept Costello's discreet accommodation. In that way, the numbers game taught him a crucial skill: how to convert illegal commerce into legitimate political capital. Gambling and bookmaking were natural extensions. Restaurants with backrooms, private clubs, and illicit casinos multiplied his reach beyond the Lower East Side into neighborhoods frequented by wealthier patrons. These operations required a slightly different skill set: tasteful presentation, plausible deniability, and a capacity to shield high-value clients from exposure. Costello excelled. He hired managers who could run rooms with discretion, cultivated servers and hosts who were both charming and loyal, and found lawyers who could structure ownerships to minimize traceable connections. He was building enterprises that looked, from the outside, almost respectable. Costello's partnership network expanded accordingly. He was pragmatic about race and ethnicity, preferring to form alliances where they made business sense. Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Charles Lucky Luciano were natural collaborators. They brought financial acumen, contacts in national circuits, and an appetite for scale. Costello offered political pathways connections to union leaders, local bosses, and municipal officials that could convert underworld revenue into durable institutional advantages. Together, they moved money into legitimate fronts, invested in racetracks, and even explored casino opportunities where regulation was weak. But the defining feature of Costello's strategy was not merely money, it was influence. He cultivated relationships with labor leaders who could turn votes and organize strikes, and he placed discreet favors where they mattered. A city contract steered to a friendly company, a favorable hearing scheduled for an allied proprietor, a polite phone call that persuaded a newspaper editor to bury an awkward story. These were the strokes of his art. He met men who matter in smoke-filled rooms and restaurants, and he treated them with a diplomat's courtesy. They, in turn, learned to treat him as a resource. The network extended into Tammany-style politics and City Hall. Costello was not the sort to run for office, but he learned how to put the right men into office, back campaigns that would protect his operations and provide union support when election battles needed boots on the ground. In return, politicians protected his activities with selective enforcement and convenient oversight. This mutualism blurred lines. Laws were still on the books, but their application often depended on unseen balances of power. Media relations also mattered. Costello cultivated friendly reporters and proprietors who could be nudged to write gentler profiles or ignore unsavory details. He learned to manage public image charity donations, theater box seats for local elites, and careful public appearances softened a criminal profile into that of a respectable man with influence. The optics were intentional. The better he looked in the public eye, the more fragile the justification for aggressive probes into his activities. Costello's rise wasn't merely managerial, it was also political theater. He became adept at using patronage as leverage, using favors to create obligations. When a district leader owed him a favor, it might mean a rapid permit approval. When a police captain respected him, it could mean muted raids. This web of reciprocal obligations became self-reinforcing. The more favors he granted, the thicker his network of men who could be called upon in a crisis. Yet his methods invited enemies as well as allies. Old-school bosses who valued open displays of force sometimes regarded Costello with scorn. He was not the archetypal brute. He was a broker, and brokers are, in the eyes of some, less manly than warriors. That disdain mixed with fear. Political protection was powerful, but could be brittle if public scrutiny intensified. Costello's careful camouflage relied on a tacit acceptance between underworld and city officials, a bargain that could fracture if investigators found a thread and began to pull. Prohibition offered an enormous accelerator. The illegal liquor trade expanded gambling's cash flows and opened new channels for payoffs. Costello used the era not to clumsily seize territories by force, but to embed his operations within city life. Speakeasies that catered to elite patrons generated both revenue and social proof. Casinos in Havana and nightclubs in Miami venues, favored by Americans seeking loosened morals, provided opportunities to launder profits and to invest in enterprises that could be presented as legitimate investments abroad. As Costello's influence grew, so did the scale of what he could arrange. Labor peace during sensitive strikes, favorable rulings for friendly businesses, and discreet solutions for politicians who needed quiet help. He became, in many ways, an indispensable fixer for a city that preferred things to hum along. People sought him not because they feared him, but because they needed him, and he charged accordingly. By the end of this phase of his life, Frank Costello was no longer merely a local gambler or numbers man. He had become a political actor whose stable of favors, alliances, and discreet operations made him a central node in New York's overlapping circuits of money, power, and influence. That network would protect him for years, but it would also draw attention. When investigators began to scrutinize the seams between crime and politics, they would find Costello's fingerprints everywhere. The quiet of his method had kept him safe, until the world around him grew louder and more demanding of accountability. Frank Costello's greatest power was not measured in guns or bodies. It was measured in appointments, committees, and the quiet influence that turned bureaucrats into allies. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, he had woven a web through New York's unions, back rooms of political clubs, and the corridors of power in Washington. That network shielded his rackets and made him a living argument that America's institutions could be bent as easily as steel if someone knew which bolts to turn. Costello's approach to influence was surgical. He cultivated precinct captains and borough officials, cultivated union chiefs who could deliver votes, and built relationships with businessmen who needed labor peace and city contracts. He understood patronage, a favor here, an arranged meeting there, a donation routed through a charity. Each small act accumulated into an obligation. Those obligations functioned like a ledger of political debt. When Costello needed a favor, he'd cash it in. When a politician needed ground troops, Costello's network could supply them. It was a quiet barter system that made most confrontations unnecessary. This interplay between illicit money and formal politics drew increasing attention after World War II. The American public had become more attuned to corruption. Investigators, journalists, and reformers pushed to follow the money and to expose the hidden connections between organized crime and government. In many ways, Costello had been living under a delayed audit. His methods were effective precisely because they were invisible, but invisibility also made them fragile once someone lit a match. The catalyst came through a convergence of forces: national anxieties about corruption, the growth of federal law enforcement capacity, and high-profile scandals put organized crime on the front pages. Senators and congressional committees, eager to show they were protecting the Republic, began to cast light into the spaces Costello preferred to keep dark. The stage was set for a public accounting. Costello's moment in the harsh glare arrived with the U.S. Senate Special Committee to investigate organized crime in interstate commerce, chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver. The Kefauver hearings, televised, dramatic, and relentless, were an American civic spectacle. For the first time, the public could watch investigations of underworld figures unfold, live. The hearings blended legal inquiry with theater. Witnesses were called, cameras rolled, and names that had only existed in whispers were suddenly spoken on national television. Costello reacted like a seasoned diplomat. He had long experience managing reputations and had the right instincts for how to navigate a theater of scrutiny. He retained public relations savvy lawyers, coached friendly witnesses, and leaned on political allies to defend the image he had carefully crafted. But even the best-managed scandals have weak seams. The hearings were not merely about exposure. They were about mapping networks, drawing the lines between mob figures and public officials, and producing evidence that prosecutors could potentially use. The Kefauver hearings revealed uncomfortable linkages, names of businessmen seen entering nightclubs, union leaders with unexplained cash flows, politicians shaken by backroom pressure. Testimonies painted a picture of influence, how payoffs were arranged, how favors were requested, how media smearing could be orchestrated. For Costello, who had built his career on discreet mediation, this public accounting was particularly dangerous. When allegations are made in court, there are procedures and limits. When allegations are made on live television, reputations are shredded in real time. Yet Costello's response was not simply defiance, it was management. He leveraged his political tusks to blunt probes when possible, moved allies into favorable positions, and used the very media attention to project a different narrative, that he was a respectable businessman victimized by overzealous prosecutors and political opportunists. The image of a well-dressed man with civic friends fighting a witch hunt could be persuasive to segments of the public. Costello knew how to make himself seem like an establishment figure targeted by populist zeal, an effective strategy in a country suspicious of governmental overreach. The hearings also produced a secondary effect. They elevated rivalries. Men who had once deferred to Costello's political power began to covet the same levers of influence. Younger, more violent figures in the Mafia, those who had little patience for waiting or for the slow, patient diplomacy that Costello favored, saw the exposure as proof that political protection could evaporate. In their calculus, the time was ripe to assert street-level control, to seize territories, and to press hard where once gentle pressure had sufficed. One rivalry in particular would reshape Costello's fate. Vito Genovese, an old-world mafioso returned from wartime exile, harbored ambitions that collided with Costello's soft power model. Genovese represented the faction that prized direct authority and territorial domination. He believed the Mafia should not be so dependent on political grease and friendly judges. He favored a hierarchy that used fear and military-style enforcement to secure profits. The Kefauver hearings, in Genovese's view, had weakened Costello's argument that influence alone could protect their operations. As the Senate televised names that had been whispered, Genovese and his allies saw both danger and opportunity. If Costello's network was exposed, the brittle weave of patronage could unravel, and the vacuum would be there for the taking. In that sense, the Kefauver hearings did more than embarrass Costello. They changed power dynamics inside the Mafia. The public spectacle of accountability encouraged certain bosses to risk the old, violent levers of power in pursuit of more direct control. Costello did not welcome this contest. He tried to weather the political storm, using the legal tools and public relations defenses available to him. Yet he was less effective in fighting enemies who operated by different rules, those who used assassination as a language, not a last resort. His methods, which excelled at coercing votes and closeting favors, were less well suited against men who prioritized sudden, decisive displays of force to settle disputes. Nevertheless, for a time, Costello's political machine held. He continued to operate within the shadowy intersection of union bosses, corrupt officials, and enterprising businessmen. He continued to place calls that changed appointments, to arrange patronage that steadied operations, and to keep the gears of his enterprises greased. But the hearings had changed the ground beneath him. Once exposed networks draw attention not only from reformers, but also from rivals who see new openings. The Senate hearings were a watershed. They demonstrated the reach of public scrutiny, and how it could unsettle the carefully balanced deals upon which men like Costello relied. They also showed the limits of what influence could protect. Publicity, by design, corrodes covert arrangements. In public life, optics are often the first casualty of scandal. And in Costello's case, optics would matter in ways that would soon become deadly. By the time the televised hearings had run their course, the political landscape was altered. Costello had been bruised, but not yet broken. The seeds of his undoing were planted not in courtrooms or in Senate chambers alone, but in a reshuffled underworld where rival ambitions and old-school violence were reasserting themselves. What had once been a realm of whispered favors was, increasingly, a place of bold gambits. And Costello, who had always preferred negotiation to bloodshed, was edging toward a confrontation that would test everything he had built. For a man whose principal weapons had been influence and discretion, a bullet is the most inconvenient kind of proof. Frank Costello's world had been built on the quiet art of bargaining and the patient accumulation of favors. When the shot rang out on a street in Manhattan, it did more than wound flesh. It signaled that a new logic was rising in organized crime, boldness, violence, and a hunger for explicit control that could not be negotiated away. The date was May 2nd, 1957. Costello had just left a Manhattan nightclub after an evening of meetings and made his way across the street when a gunman stepped from the shadows and fired. Point blank. Costello was struck in the head and survived by the thinnest of margins. The attack was an attempted execution, a message wrapped in lead, and it reverberated far beyond the pavement and the sirens. For Costello, the shooting was a rupture. It transformed the calculus of his enemies and forced him to reckon with forces he had long kept at arm's length. To understand why someone would try to kill Costello, you must understand the shifting power dynamics of the American Mafia. Costello's soft power model brokerage with politicians and unions, carefully managed payoffs, and an emphasis on institutional influence had long been viable precisely because others accepted the bargain. But the post-war era had produced men with different appetites. Returning wartime mafiosi, like Vito Genovese, favored old-school command, territories secured by fear, rivals removed violently, and direct lines of authority replacing negotiated settlements. Genovese had returned from Italy with ambitions that outstripped the patient arrangements of men like Costello. He wanted control, unambiguous, centralized control. In his calculus, the occasional compromise with politicians was a distraction. What he desired was dominance, and he saw Costello as an obstacle, a powerful intermediary whose political ties could complicate the straightforward seizure of territory. In the dirty arithmetic of the underworld, removing Costello would remove a protector, unsettle the political balance, and open a path to unchecked influence. The assassination attempt was not an act of random violence. It was a political play. Whether Genovese ordered the hit directly or blessed the move through intermediaries, the result was the same. The man who had long brokered power in smoke-filled rooms was suddenly vulnerable. The shooting exposed the limits of political shielding. Favors and ballots could not prevent a trigger being pulled by a rival who preferred force to negotiation. Costello's survival, however, changed the immediate outcomes in curious ways. The public outcry and the law enforcement dragnet that followed the shooting created an environment hostile to overt mob vengeance. Genovese had miscalculated some of the consequences. The high-profile attempt drew too many eyes. Federal attention intensified, and prosecutors smelled opportunity. In a twist of fate, the violence that was intended to secure Genovese's position also provided the very fodder federal authorities needed to act decisively. Almost immediately after the shooting, authorities turned up the pressure on Genovese himself. In 1959, he was indicted on narcotics charges in a case that many historians believe was at least partly the product of rivals and law enforcement reacting to his ambitious reach. The courtroom drama resulted in Genovese's conviction and imprisonment for a long term, removing him from the power equation. The intended victor became a prisoner. The man he sought to crush remained alive, albeit wounded and politically diminished. For Costello, the attempted murder and its fallout initiated an irreversible decline. Pragmatic by nature, he recognized that his position had been fatally compromised. The visibility of the attack had eroded the very secrecy upon which his model depended, and the ascendancy and subsequent fall of Genovese made clear how brittle alliances had become. Costello's intuition told him that the game had changed. Those who prized direct force had the capacity to upend arrangements that had once seemed durable. In response, Costello made choices that reflected both survival instinct and bitter calculation. He ceded certain positions and withdrew from frontline disputes. He surrendered public prominence and retreated into relative seclusion, trusting that withdrawal would save both life and earnings. He moved away from the limelight his network had once shielded him from, and he accepted a quieter life, largely removed from the day-to-day operations where new, bolder men were now writing the rules. Costello's retreat did not mean he vanished completely. He retained some influence through old contacts and through men who continued to value the kind of political access only he could provide. But the era of him as an indispensable intermediary, someone who could orchestrate outcomes with a phone call, was ending. The Mafia's center of gravity had shifted toward younger, tougher operators who favored rapid consolidation over slow diplomacy. The attempted assassination also left an imprint on Costello personally. He had always preferred elegance to brutality, conversation to confrontation. Surviving a close-range execution altered how he viewed the Underworld's future. He was more aware of the mortal vulnerability even of those who had covered themselves with polite connections. That awareness informed the rest of his life. He was more guarded in his meetings, less likely to walk the streets unaccompanied, and slower to trust emerging leaders whose loyalties were untested. The legal fallout, too, was consequential. The public hearings and investigations that had partly exposed Costello's networks now accelerated into criminal cases that targeted other figures close to him. The federal government, empowered by the publicity and by new tools of investigation, pursued charges more aggressively. Costello himself would face indictments and investigations, although he was never fully brought down by a single prosecution in the dramatic way some of his peers were. In the decades after the shooting, Costello's name remained associated with both political finesse and personal vulnerability. He would live out the remainder of his life with diminished authority, a respected elder in some circles, an obsolete strategist in others. The assassination attempt had not only taken a physical toll, it had signaled that the Underworld's balance had shifted toward more overt, uncompromising forms of power. When historians assess Costello's arc, the shooting is a central hinge point. Before it, he epitomized a model of influence that softened the edge of criminality with political accommodation. After it, the mood of the Mafia hardened. Younger men preferred swift, violent clarity to the messy diplomacy of negotiation. Costello's story thereafter is one of adaptation and survival rather than command. He had brokered power in an age when influence could often outmaneuver force. But the age had passed. The bullet that nearly killed him announced the arrival of a new, sterner epoch in organized crime. After the gunshot that nearly killed him, Frank Costello's life entered a new, quieter phase, one defined less by rackets and backroom deals and more by courtrooms, public scrutiny, and a slow withdrawal from the corridors of influence he had once navigated so effortlessly. The attempted assassination on May 2, 1957, was the violent punctuation that signaled a tectonic shift. The old bargain between shadow power and public institutions had frayed, and men who once prospered in the margins were now being dragged into the glare. Costello's legal troubles had long been intermittent companions. Investigations, grand juries, and whispered probes had followed him for decades. His talent had often been finding ways to duck the worst consequences. But the late 1950s and early 1960s were different. The Kefauver hearings and the growing appetite for televised, hard-line accountability had shifted public expectations. Law enforcement agencies were growing more professional and more coordinated. Federal prosecutors were developing new tools and a more aggressive posture that could not be shrugged off with a well-placed favor. In the years after the shooting, Costello found himself navigating a legal and political environment that no longer rewarded discretion in the same way. He was called before committees, questioned by federal agents, and his name appeared repeatedly in press accounts that undermined the anonymity he once cherished. Where his political caches once softened legal impulses, the publicity surrounding his activities made such protections brittle. A favored judge or a pliant precinct captain could no longer assure immunity when cameras and congressional investigators were watching. Costello faced multiple legal challenges, not all of them reducible to a single headline case, but cumulatively punishing. Prosecutors indicted associates, targeted rackets tied to him, and used newly developed investigative techniques to follow the money. The sting of exposure meant that Costello's safest option was increasingly retreat. He did not so much suffer a single catastrophic conviction as he experienced an erosion of effective power. Allies were prosecuted or retired. Political patrons moved on, and new leaders in the underworld proved less patient with the delicate diplomacy that had been his craft. Exile for Costello was therefore more political and social than geographic. He was not shipped overseas or jailed for life. Rather, he was marginalized from the active centers of power he used to control. The very networks he had built began to reroute around him. Younger, more aggressive bosses favored blunt force over negotiation. The city's political machines evolved, and reform-minded officials reduced the space for the semi-legal arrangements Costello had long exploited. In short, he had been pushed into a sort of internal exile, present in name and memory, but stripped of decisive influence. This retreat was not wholly passive. Costello attempted to preserve what he could. He leaned on old friendships, tested legal defenses, and tried to keep revenue flowing through trusted hands. He invested in legitimate fronts where possible and encouraged associates to stay discreet. But the psychology of his position changed. He moved less often in public. He was more cautious about meetings, preferring filtered channels to face-to-face encounters. The man who once made appointments with a phone call began to rely on proxies and deputies, aware that visibility now carried immediate legal risk. The courtroom episodes that followed were, in many ways, theater. Some hearings produced no convictions. Others yielded indictments that were later reduced or negotiated away. Yet each episode exacted a toll: legal fees, attention, the erosion of trust among partners, and the incremental loss of the political cover that had once made his operations possible. The slow attrition of influence felt like exile. The city that had once bent to his requests now treated him as a man to be investigated. Health also became a factor. Costello was no longer the vigorous fixer of his prime. The stress of legal battles, the psychological aftershocks of the assassination attempt, and the natural wear of time reduced his appetite for confrontation. He adopted a lower profile, making fewer public appearances and refusing the flashy lifestyles that once served as his quiet armor. Where earlier he had been a shadowy man of elegance, by the 1960s he resembled an elder statesman fading into the wings. In these final decades, Costello's personal life took on new emphasis. He spent more time with family and inside the narrow circles of longtime friends. He continued to enjoy restaurants and theater, pleasures that had always been part of his persona, but did so with a lighter public footprint. He cultivated a semblance of respectability that, for some, softened the earlier image of an underworld boss. For others, prosecutors, reformers, and rivals, the soft public face was simply a mask over a lifetime of organized corruption. Historically, Costello's later years are often framed as a study in decline rather than redemption. He did not regain the political clout he once held. His era had passed. Still, his influence persisted in subtler ways. Men who had once answered his calls or taken his counsel rose into positions of lesser, but still meaningful, power. His model of leveraging politics for profit, the quiet brokerage of favors, continued to echo in city politics, even as the most blatant forms of open corruption waned. When Costello died in the early 1970s, it was not with the dramatic finality of a mafia execution or a courtroom martyrdom. His passing was more prosaic. The end of a long life lived partly in shadow and partly in the light of public notoriety. Obituaries noted both his criminal associations and his civic ties. Historians would later debate his place in the pantheon of organized crime. A man less of guns than of phones, less of violence than of influence. The legacy of Frank Costello's twilight years is complex. On one hand, his withdrawal underscores a moral arc many reformers like to point to. Public scrutiny and legal reform can, over time, shrink the space in which corruption flourishes. On the other hand, his relative comfort in old age, the absence of a dramatic legal ruin, suggests a more ambiguous truth. Power can often blunt accountability, or at least defer it. Costello's life after the shooting illustrates both the fragility and the resilience of shadow structures. They can be exposed, reorganized, and marginalized, but they rarely disappear overnight. In the end, Part 6 of Costello's story is less about courtroom verdicts than about the slow narrowing of options. A political exile without physical deportation, a retreat from active leadership, and a final chapter in which survival, not triumph, became the primary objective. His final years closed the book on a model of underworld power that was transactional, genteel in its manner, and extraordinarily adept at converting influence into profit. That book did not vanish when he did. It left traces in unions, municipal politics, and the quieter corners of American power. that historians and reformers would continue to study for decades to come. Frank Costello did not die in a blaze of cinematic violence. He did not fall in a hail of bullets on a rain-slicked street, nor was he carted away in handcuffs for one final definitive trial. Instead, his final years were defined by the quieter things that had shaped his life: careful retreats, damaged reputations, and the steady, inevitable dimming of influence. When he died in the early 1970s, it was the close of an era, the end of the chapter on a particular model of underworld power whose fingerprint still lingers on American institutions. Costello's death was the punctuation on a life lived partly in public and mostly in the wings. For decades he had been a lesson in how influence can be engineered through favors, placements, and patient cultivation. He had walked comfortably in two worlds, entering elegant restaurants and political clubs with the same ease he exercised in backrooms and gambling dens. But his passing forced a more measured historical accounting. What did his style of power cost society? And what did its endurance tell us about the durability of corruption? To understand Costello's legacy is to grasp the duality of his influence. On the one hand, he demonstrated how soft power could be extraordinarily effective. Rather than relying primarily on violence, he built networks that made problems quietly disappear. Need a permit? Call him. Need a judge to look the other way? Call him. Need union muscle for a campaign? He could arrange it. That ability to convert criminal capacity into political utility was, in many ways, genius. It offered a model of organized crime that folded into civic life rather than standing apart from it. On the other hand, that same folding created corrosive, long-lived problems. When political favors and private payoffs become part of how a city operates, accountability erodes. Public contracts can be steered, enforcement can be selective, and the very notion of a level playing field becomes degraded. Costello's career is a case study in how informal influence networks can hollow out public institutions. The damage is less sensational than a headline murder, but often deeper. The public pays more in compromised governance than in the short-term profits stolen by rackets. Costello's story also reframes the conventional narrative about the Mafia. Popular imagination often privileges the violent, cinematic gangland boss, the man with muscle and fury. Costello shows another path, a patient, relational kind of power that depends on reputation, reciprocal obligation, and the invisible architecture of favors. In that sense, he is an instructive counterpoint to more violent figures. The Mafia is not monolithic. It contains multitudes, strategies, and trade-offs. Soft power can be as effective and as dangerous as blunt force. Legally and institutionally, Costello's career had a paradoxical long-term effect. In the short run, patronage and corruption allowed him to operate with impunity. But the very effectiveness of those methods helped spur a more sophisticated response. As prosecutors and investigators recognized that organized crime had embedded itself deep within political and business structures, they developed new tools to pursue it: joint federal task forces, financial forensics, and eventually comprehensive laws aimed at dismantling organizations rather than merely prosecuting individual crimes. The modernization of law enforcement, its move toward coordinated, systemic investigation, was in part a reaction to the sophistication Costello and his contemporaries exhibited. In a sense, his success forced the public system to evolve. Culturally, Costello's life left an imprint as well. Cinema and television loved the figure of the smooth operator, the man who negotiates over brandy, rather than barking orders over a corpse. The diplomacy, the gifts, the whispered favors, the polite voice on the phone. These became familiar tropes in portrayals of the underworld. Costello's persona fed stories where corruption felt domestic and comfortable, making the idea of organized crime both glamorous and eerily mundane. That ambivalence helped shape how audiences perceived the line between legitimate influence and corruption. Another dimension of his legacy lies in the institutions he touched. Unions, local political machines, and entertainment venues sometimes bore traces of his influence for years. Practices of patronage, patterns of selective enforcement, and informal expectations that favors would be repaid. Reformers and investigative journalists would spend decades unraveling these entanglements, and the process of reform was slow and uneven. But the cracks that Costello's model revealed also created opportunities for strengthening oversight. More transparent contracting, watchdog journalism, and civic reform movements aimed at breaking reciprocal obligations that had become corruptive. There are moral lessons embedded in Costello's arc. First, power that looks respectable can be as erosive as power that is openly brutal. The gentility of a suit and the language of philanthropy can mask transactions that undermine justice. Second, institutional resilience matters more than individual culpability. When systems are strong, transparent procurement, independent law enforcement, free press, individual operators find it harder to bend public life to their will. Costello's life is an argument for building those resilient structures, because the alternative is decades of quiet corruption that misallocates resources and lowers trust. Finally, his story is a reminder that strategies have life cycles. Costello's soft power model was incredibly effective in one era, when political machines were centralized and patronage systems were robust. But the very success that made it useful also made it brittle. Once public scrutiny intensified and law enforcement adapted, new generations of criminals preferred more overt power. Public institutions became more capable. Social norms shifted. That cycle method works. Method consolidates power. Method becomes exposed. Method declines. Is a pattern repeated across history. Costello's life is an elegant example of that normative arc. When historians and students of power look back at Frank Costello, they do not simply see a gangster. They see an operator who demonstrated the central truth about modern power. Systems matter. Whether in City Hall or a gambling den, whether by gun or by handshake, creating durable influence requires building networks. And networks can be the most resilient form of authority. In Costello's case, they were resilient long enough to matter, and vulnerable enough to be dismantled. His death closed a chapter, but the book he helped write remained open for reformers, prosecutors, and storytellers to continue reading and debating. And so his final legacy is mixed, an instructive caution about how influence operates, a spur to institutional reform, and a cultural archetype that keeps us asking hard questions about where power hides when we are not looking.